Now these are some other kind of really common bees that you'll see in and around your yard, but these are different than the ones we've been looking at before. These are all ground nesting bees. Again, the vast majority of ground nesting bees are solitary. They live a life very similar to those wood nesting bees, except they dig their own tunnels and then they provision series of young in those own tunnels. Each species has a kind of a different medium or a different soil type that they really prefer. It's really beneficial for these animals to leave as many kind of areas of bare soil in as many different spaces on your property to kind of give the widest variety of these animals kind of access to your soil. Now, interestingly enough, these sweat bees are what's known as a semi-social bee, and they're actually being studied by scientists because we're trying to still figure out how and why ancient bees kind of took that first leap from living solitary lives to becoming social bees, where they kind of cooperated in large hives. And these bees are being heavily studied because some species are actually able to determine if they're going to be solitary or social. And so on extremely difficult seasons where they really need to work together to supply enough food for a hive, these bees will normally live together in small hives with one or several queens that they all kind of work under. But if it's an easy season, they don't really need to work, they'll go the solitary way and kind of just kind of survive on their own. And these are very common bees. Sweat bees are normally the size of a grain of rice, and they're very often found on you as they're kind of landing on you, if you couldn't tell by the name, to drink your sweat. They like to lap off our perspirations in the search of nutrients and salts. And interestingly enough, a lot of them are profoundly iridescently colored. There's some blues, greens, of course, and even oranges in this area. And even though these iridescent coatings kind of stand out to our eyes and makes it easier for us to see them, scientists believe those iridescent coatings are actually a form of camouflage that forms to actually hide them from insects and other predators. And that's actually probably due to the way that insects and some other predators view the world around them. And they view the world very differently than we do. For example, bees can actually see the polarity of light. And what that means is they can see the direction that light is traveling in. And so it's believed that due to that kind of hard to grasp kind of vision that they have, it's thought that as sunlight kind of hits that iridescent coating and kind of shoots back at the viewer, it's very confusing if they can view the polarity of light, because it's basically a ton of different directions that the light is traveling in. Bees can also see light in the ultraviolet spectrum, and that's really important for them because just like we were talking about with those tiny structures on many petals for flowers, the colors of many flowers are often very different to bee eyes than they are to our eyes. For example, most, if not all, flowers have what's known as floral nectar guides, or basically hidden signals that can only be seen if they're viewed under the ultraviolet spectrum. A lot of those kind of guiding signals kind of point the way towards the inside of the flower, kind of helps the bee find the good stuff. And so, again, many flowers, even plain, almost one might say boring, even though of course I would not, but even those kind of plain flowers are very ebullient. They really stand out to many bee eyes because, again, many of them are secretly coated just to stand out to those eyes. Here's some more pictures of these sweat bees. And even if they're solitary, many of our sweat bees are what's known as gregarious. And what that means is they like to nest next to other solitary bees of the same or similar species. So you can think of these bees as really enjoying kind of the neighborhood life cycle or the neighborhood lifestyle. They like to live next to other bees, even though they don't share labor. Those kind of big congregations of bees will kind of watch each other's nests and kind of protect them from predators or pests that might be trying to sneak in. Now, let's talk about probably one of the most easily recognized bees in and around your garden just through their size alone. Now, bumblebees are one of our few social bees here in North America. They live in small colonies of about 50 to maybe a few hundred individuals, and they really enjoy nesting in abandoned rodent nests or abandoned bird nests, and sometimes also at the base of grass tufts, especially really dense tufting grasses like switchgrass. And so to really foster these animals, both leave abandoned nests on your property when you find them, and of course just foster a wide population of tufting grasses on your area. You'll really bring these really important pollinators closer to you. Now, These have several bee superpowers. First off, bumblebees are the only North American bees that can make honey and beeswax. And they do so in just the same way that honeybees do. Basically, these bees ingest or drink nectar, and they insert basically an enzyme into that nectar called invertase. What that enzyme does is it actually splits up the sucrose, the complex sugar that's in nectar. It splits it up into its small, simple sugar constituents, so glucose and fructose. Now, those simple sugars can actually fit much closer together than the complex sugar sucrose. And so basically, what bees are able to do with that invertase is cram a solution so full of sugar that literally nothing else can fit or grow in that. And that's basically what honey is. And so that's one reason why honey is what's known as antimicrobial. It's because basically there's just no room in it. It's a super saturated solution. There's no room in it for anything to grow. And bumblebees do that in just the same way that honeybees do. And they also are able to make beeswax, which again, the vast majority of other bees can't. Now, the major difference between the two is honeybees are actually one of the very few bee colony species that survive the whole year as a colony. And so because of that, honeybees have developed the capacity to both make and store huge amounts of honey to just feed the whole colony throughout the winter time when there aren't any flowers out and about in the real world. Now, our bumblebee colonies are very different. Actually, in late fall, new queens are born in bumblebee colonies, and new males are born as well. They mate with each other, and then the new females actually leave the nest, and they find shelter in leaf litter or under mulch or other similarly protected locations, and they actually spend the winter hidden in your landscape. And actually, bumblebee queens will distribute a kind of a sugary antifreeze solution throughout their bodies to make sure that they don't freeze, or to be more accurate, to determine exactly where they freeze. And then the following spring, the queen emerges from that leaf litter or the mulch pile or the hollow tree. She founds a new colony all on her own, and she does all of the work for the first couple weeks until her first generation hatches and takes over that job. And so next spring, as you see the first bumblebee queens flying in and around your landscape, that's more than likely your first bumblebee queen. And so give her a high five and wish her well for the rest of the year. You can see that bumblebees are one of our only species of bee here in the States that have those corbiculi, or those pollen pants. And really, what they use them for, again, is to effectively bring back as much pollen as they can because they've got a growing number of young back home. Now, even though they do have those corbiculi, bumblebees tend to have very fuzzy hair, and because of that, they're very messy. They tend to pollinate much more than, say, a honeybee does. Now, bumblebees also have another bee superpower. They're experts at what is known as sonication, or buzz pollination. What these animals can do is basically when they land on a flower, they vibrate their flight muscles at very specific frequencies. And that serves to dislodge pollen, especially in very difficult flowers. Now, this is actually especially effective in inverted flower types. So think any flowers that are upside down, like a tomato or a blueberry. Studies have found that those plants, when pollinated by a buzz pollination pollinating specialist, they tend to be larger, there's more fruit set, and actually they're about, I think it's between 20 and 50% larger if they're buzz pollinated versus other types of pollination. And so these bees pick up a lot of slack, again, especially in our native plants that have those inverted or upside down blooms. These bumblebees are actually incredibly intelligent as well. They're one of the few bees that's really been studied, extensively in labs. One of the reasons is because they're just kind of large and easy to control. But science has found them to be incredible backyard Einsteins. They can count to 5. They can recognize faces, both human faces and bee faces. And they've actually been the subject of some pretty interesting and compelling studies that really kind of pinpoint their kind of hidden brain power. One of my favorite studies was actually showing these bees kind of shapes that they were conditioned to kind of go to a certain shape to get a sugary reward. And so, for example, in this study, maybe these bees were trained to go to a circle in order to get a sugary reward. Now, they learned how to get to that circle as it was lit, but then the scientists turned out the lights, And bumblebees were actually able to divine the shapes of their different landing pads based on feel alone. Now, that's a pretty profound problem-solving skills, and also, they've also been shown to really help out a wide variety of animals in and around a landscape. What you're seeing here is a bumblebee doing what's known as nectar robbing. And now, it sounds worse than it is. Basically, what these bees do, if they're in an area that have especially restrictive flowers, or blooms that, say like this lobelia, are kind of formed in a way that restricts access to certain animals, these bumblebees, sometimes in flowers that they can't access if they're feeling a little bit lazy, they'll go down to the base of the flower and they bite a hole kind of right at the base, normally where the nectar is, and they kind of crane their tongue into the hole, kind of take the easy way out to kind of bypass a lot of the flower structure and feed on the flower itself. Now, it's good for the bee, but also a lot of smaller insects, especially in a heavily restricted environment where there's a lot of those restricted blooms, these nectar-robbing holes will actually give a wide variety of animals, especially small ones, access to these blooms as well. And so these larger bees with these strong nectar-robbing jaws are really important for kind of opening up kind of a landscape to kind of a whole host of pollinators. And that's another really great point. When you're thinking about planting for bees and other pollinators, you want to not only have a wide diversity of plants in the space so that the space will cater to the widest amount of wildlife, but also you want a wide variety of flower shapes and sizes. Because again, some bees have very long tongues, other pollinators like flies have very puny, almost non-existent tongues. And so you want to have both kind of semi-restrictive flowers like this, but also you want to have a profusion of very shallow, easily seen and easily accessed flowers, like say goldenrod or Joe Pye weed, a lot of our native, especially late blooming plants. But Zizia or golden Alexander is another great early season plant, and many of these plants are also host plants for a lot of native butterflies and moths as well. And so again, as you're planting and kind of planning out your space, try to have a wide variety of flower shapes and sizes. This is a great example, again, of one of those shallow, very easily seen, easily landed on flowers. Milkweed is a true cosmopolitan plant. It is, of course, a host plant for some caterpillars, but it's also an excellent pollinator plant because almost every pollinator can land on and kind of access their blooms.